just told me that there's no sound, and I just realized that I didn't hit the start broadcast button.
Oh, really? Okay.
I'm really sorry. Okay. Hi, this is the Orthodox Apologetics channel. Father Enoch and Deacon Joseph here. I forgot to press the button about 10 minutes ago, so we're going to just go really fast as to what I was talking about, what Father Enoch was talking about, and I'll help catch up so that he can get back to where he was. Basically, we were talking about Basil's first questions. We've been getting a lot of questions from different people, and the question was, Father Enoch and I have spoken in the past about imagination and prayer, whether this was practiced in the Priestess West. Could you address this practice and whether it's a later development? This practice being latent foreign to universal precedent is another indication that the Papist community fell away. Ultimately, what it came down to is that there are pious uses of the word meditation, but unfortunately, in the post-schism Roman Catholic Church, their terminology for meditation often means something very different. And unfortunately, it can get too over emotional. And okay, now I'm getting a phone call. Okay.
Well, let me finish off. So the concept was that when we use the word, a lot of these ideas of rosary meditations, which is what people are kind of talking about, that is completely foreign to the priesthood East or West. I don't even know if that actually goes. I think that may be even have been rare until you get out of the Renaissance, even in the post-schism West. Because Scupoli, Lorenzo Scupoli, who is admittedly a post-schism Latin writer of the 15th century, who wrote kind of the Unseen Warfare, which was later heavily modified and edited and things added to it by St. Nicodemus, he discourages using imagination in prayer. He discourages accepting visions and all this other stuff. So a lot of this stuff you're talking about is, I would assume, probably Counter-Reformation, Jesuit, Franciscan, mishmash, piety, that emotionalism, all this other stuff. So I think that should answer the question. If I'm not going too much in depth, I think the proper use of the word meditate is kind of like, you think upon God's statutes, but you don't imagine yourself there, at the Nativity and help in, like, because I've heard this from Roman Catholics who lived in the pre-Vatican II period about how they were supposed to do the Rosary. They supposedly were told that to imagine when they're on the run mystery about the Nativity of Christ or something like that, to imagine they were helping Saint Joseph with the firewood or something. So we don't encourage any of that. That's just opening yourself up for demonic interference and attack. Okay, so let me look at the other questions since I was sent them. One moment, opening up my email. Okay. Okay. Okay, so the next question that Basil asked was, I believe, about Thomas Aquinas and the 5 ways. Now, I haven't studied a lot of Thomism. I did try to read against the Nations and the Summa, but that was like, I think I was 14 or something, and I tried to read it a few years later, and then a few years later after that, and it was extremely boring. But I think I'm trying to remember the 5. My email was taking a long time to open up, but the 5 ways, I believe the first was something like what we might call the cosmological argument. Now, to be honest, you do find the cosmological argument in people not in go back before the schism into Eastern writers. For example, St. John Damascene gives in his, I think, the first one of the first 3-4 chapters of the Exact Exposition in Book 1, written in the 740s. He gives the basic cosmological argument. And I think you can probably find some other fathers that do the same. And that kind of goes back, I assume, to Aristotle, maybe before that. St. John Damascene, basically, it was obviously Christianized. St. John Damascene talks about a teleological argument for design. My email's still not opening up. Sorry about that. And I think there was another argument St. John Damascene gives, which was a moral argument. St. John Damascene, I believe, does in fact make, at one point in his philosophical chapters, he does give kind of a transcendental argument, but I don't believe it was directly related to God. I think it was more about the fact everybody has to have some sort of assumption about ability to reason. And so, I mean, the ontological argument, which I believe was started actually by Anselm in the late 1098 or something. I don't know I don't believe that. There are some people who argue you can find some traces of that in earlier fathers. But one of the things with I don't know what Aquinas' fifth argument was. I don't really remember. And my emails are not opening up, so I'm having a hard time looking at some of these questions people are sending. If you could post any of the questions in the chat, that would help. I think the fifth, but anyway, a lot of them, the church has occasionally used them. You got to remember when St. John Damascene gives, for example, the three arguments he uses in Book 1 of Exact Exposition for God's existence. It's really basically would be the equivalent of 2 or 3 pages. He goes over the cosmological, teleological, and the moral argument. And that's because everybody believed in God. Even whether it was the heretics, the iconoclast heretics, the Monophysites, the Muslims, you weren't really dealing with people that did not. Atheism was extremely a rare occurrence. And so they did understand these arguments, the fathers, and they did occasionally use them, but it wasn't a big part of their apologetics because you weren't arguing with a lot of atheists. I think maybe the earlier fathers would occasionally argue with Epicureans, and that does come up every now and again. I think maybe in St. Justin Martyr and a few other fathers. But even a lot of the Greek philosophical community regarded Epicureanism as ridiculous. And a lot of the arguments with the Epicureans, I'm trying to remember having read many, many years ago, a lot of it revolved around questions that would affect the larger pagan Greek philosophical framework. For example, the Greek pagan writers argued for the eternity of the world. Was the universe infinite in size, infinite, and did I have an infinite past time? The scriptures teach in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. And creation ex nihilo is taught in the scriptures. It's explicitly taught in the book of, I think, 2nd Maccabees, where the mother of the Maccabee martyrs tells them, remember that God created everything that exists out of nothing. And you find this teaching of creation ex nihilo used by the early apologist fathers in the 2nd century. I think eventually the arguments about the eternity of the world kind of petered out in the 500s, mostly because the last paganism died out. There was a man named John Philoponus who was unfortunately he left Orthodoxy and became some kind of strange Monophysite, Trithelite predecessor, weird. But he did write some books against, I think, Plotinus and others. And he did use arguments, for example, about the impossibility of infinity past time. And I think St. Photius does quote them in his book, Bibliotheca. And some of the arguments are in the abstract all right. But there wasn't a lot of argument. There wasn't a lot of... and one wonders, why was Aquinas so obsessed with proving the existence of God? I mean, of course, it's interesting and it can be to some extent important, but there weren't a lot of atheists, as far as I can understand, even in France in the year 1200. I'm sorry, I can't open up my other email account, which is where my questions were sent, because I'm logged in with this current email account to the Apologetics forum, Apologetics Live. So Basil, if you could kind of send some of these questions, put them in the chat, that would help. And let me see what are the other questions in the chat until I get some more. It says, Father, Vienna 1683 says, Father, would an absolute monarchy be the most suitable political system in an Orthodox country? And yeah, absolutely, it would. Now, by absolute monarchy, we mean the king does not have the power to violate God's law. Okay, send him through Facebook Messenger. Thanks. Okay, so the king cannot command somebody, I command you to go rape that woman or to go murder that child. If the king commands that, you have not just an ability to refuse his order, but you should not obey his order. All right. But within the realm of what is allowed within the law of God, the absolute monarchy it's absolute within that realm of God's law, what God allows for the rulers to do. And I think it would be the most suitable because the monarch imitates the father of the family, and the father has absolute general power within the realm of what is allowed by both the law of God and whatever traditions that are encapsulated in the country's laws. So things like having a democratic elected government and the rule of the people, unfortunately, these are kind of a revival of pagan concepts. Though even the classical pagans probably weren't liberal Enlightenment type people. So that's. I mean, you did have in Orthodox countries and in medieval societies, you did have some sort of kind of, I hate to use the word democracy, but kind of village councils at a village level. For example, in the Slavic world, they called them the veches. They were like kind of village assemblies where all the elder men of the village or the men of the village got together and they discussed things, and then they may have voted in some kind of primitive sense. But it didn't really much extend beyond that. And then, of course, you did have large national councils that would happen, but the king ultimately had the say on civil questions that fell within the competency of what the civil government is allowed to do. So I would say an absolute monarchy, or absolute in a certain sense dictatorship, within those frameworks is a much more suitable system in an Orthodox country. Okay, so Atomic Lead asks, and now I should note back to Vienna's question before I go to Atomic Lead, that throughout the scriptures, even when you go to the period immediately after the time of Joshua and you go into the period of the judges had a tremendous amount of authority. They were kind of what kept the Israelite confederation together, because if you look into the book of Judges, what does it consistently say? It says, then there was no king in the land, and every man did what he thought was best in his own mind. Because when Moses ruled Israel, he was prophet, he was priest, because it says Moses and Aaron among his priests in the book of, and Samuel among his prophets in the book of Psalms, and he was a prophet. So because he was obviously a prototype of Christ. So Moses had a large amount of authority, and then Joshua takes over, and Joshua has a similar amount of authority. All right. And then of course, once those men repose, and then the Israel kind of has this kind of confederated system, just chaos begins to ensue. And people begin to do weird things like, rape women and chop them up. All kinds of terrible things begin to transpire until the time that a strong monarchy is established. Now, that being said, internal civil war was prevented as a rule during most of the monarchy. There were problems. And the major problem with the monarchy, however, was in the Israelite period where the monarchs embraced idolatry because of foreign wives and such. But that was a common problem even throughout Israelite society. So I don't think you can blame that primarily on the monarch. And I know this gets into a very big question because of people take the warnings of the prophet Samuel as if those were attacks on the concept of the king. But I don't think that's the proper way to see that. Okay, so Atomic Lead asks, there is a certain lengthy article by a traditionalist Thomist against orthodoxy I've seen referenced several times in arguments. May I share it here and ask for remarks on it at a later show? Yeah, sure, go ahead. So Vienna has a follow-up, and he says, Father, can you give me 5 arguments that prove Christianity so that I can convince my girlfriend to become Orthodox? She wants to believe in God. She just needs the evidence. Okay, well, let me try to think about how I would do this. Well, she doesn't believe in God. She's an atheist, I assume. So I would ask, why does she believe there's something rather than nothing? All right. Why are we even able to communicate if logic and all the laws of reason are simply products of the human imagination and random chemical imbalances and balances and reactions? How can random chemical processes in any way produce logical thought? Where did the universe come from? Agnostic. How do you explain the resurrection of Christ when considering all the alternatives? How do you explain the existence of the Orthodox Church when it's been attacked and attempted to destroy it more than any other organization has been, the world has attempted to destroy it? So I think there are multiple layers of arguments. How do you explain the question, if you want to believe in God, how do you explain the question of infinite past time? How can there be infinite? You can imagine theoretically that there could be infinite future time, but how about infinite past time? All right, because you begin to divide things smaller and smaller, because if there's infinite past time, how did you ever arrive at the present moment? Therefore, there has to be a beginning to the universe. All right, if there's a beginning to the universe, then how did the universe begin? And I think you can argue it was created. I know some people may not like some of those arguments. I think there's a design point to go through. So I think reading the scriptures and the lives of the saints can help. That may not seem like a very heavily intellectual argument, but I'd say, oh, here's the Bible, here's the lives of the saints. Read them, and we'll talk about it. If you want to, take St. John Damascene's exact exposition of the Orthodox faith and go through it. So let's see. One point would be most of the world never believed. I mean, most of the world was not atheist, and most of the world still is not atheist, unless you count, enforced Marxist state atheism in China until the 20th century. Yes, everybody had problems with, maybe they disagreed upon what the shape of the moon was. And you can say, well, everybody believed the earth was flat or the earth was the center of the universe at this time. But everybody wasn't absolutely wrong. They believed the earth was. They may have been incorrect about the exact mechanism and the shape of it, but not about everything else. Let me see. Baitlord says, how would an absolute monarchy work when the heir to the throne could be social liberal, or perhaps they want to forcibly convert everyone to another religion? Wouldn't democracy be better? Well, I would argue that you're probably not, if you have an Orthodox society to begin with, and you have an absolute monarchy and a traditional patriarchal social system, you're not really going to have a social liberal. But if you had some kind of crazy guy that kind of got in, like, I don't know, he's like, all the other heirs died and some cousin was the only other guy. If he tried to, I don't know, convert the country to another religion, you can resist that. And you do not have to obey him, and you should not obey him. So people may misunderstand what I'm saying by absolute monarchy. The state, the apparatus. If you had like some kind of an Orthodox society, and for some reason, like a Muslim, a guy became emperor, and he then decided, I'm going to be a Muslim, and everybody's going to be Muslim. What should be done? Well, the apparatus of state authority, the Praetorian Guard or whatever, the nobility, the ruling class should simply just arrest him and hold him down, not kill him, but restrict his power and appoint a regent until such time as he either reconverts to Orthodoxy, or a new heir is found after this man dies. So I think you have options, and options have traditionally existed in the Byzantine Empire. They did have palace revolutions. By revolution, we don't mean what we think of in the modern sense. They kind of had changes of governments. If the emperor became a heretic or he was like insane, and they did overthrow the emperor, they didn't like doing it, and they only did it in extreme cases, like he would be some kind of weird apostate heretic or he was insane. And the Byzantine system worked for 1,000 years, despite the fact they had to dethrone emperors, every maybe 200 years or something like that, because it was insane or crazy. But the state apparatus, you might see the bureaucracy still was able to carry on. So I don't think democracy would be better, because technically, for the one or two bad emperors you can find every 200 years, in a democracy you're going to constantly find bad members of parliament, bad members of Congress, bad presidents, prime ministers. They can be easily bribed because they don't have absolute power or absolute authority. It's easier to bribe a president or a member of Congress than it is to bribe the emperor, because the emperor has everything he needs. Okay, so Basil says the transcendental arguments are really helpful as well. The very act of speech or movement towards the telos presupposes logos. Yes, I think the transcendental arguments are actually very good. All I'm saying is I would be too much against saying that the other arguments that St. John Damascene gives, which are cosmological, teleological, and moral, are bad. I think you can probably have a combination and say that our very ability to argue and to even think about these other arguments presuppose transcendental points. I would just be against anyone saying that cosmological argument that St. John Damascene proposes is evil or is bad or we shouldn't use it. Because you can certainly prove. I mean, with the transcendental argument, you can prove the existence of a transcendental reality, but you have to get to a better point than just a transcendental impersonal power. I mean, with a teleological argument, you can get to things like with a cosmological argument, you can get to things that the universe is not infinite, I think, and past time, therefore had to have a creation moment and therefore a creator. With a teleological argument that St. John Damascene provides, you can get to the point that the creator designs things, and with the moral argument that there is a moral order. And of course, still, the problem is that even with all these points, you're still getting to a figure that's still kind of far removed. And that's when you have to definitely talk about the incarnation. And I think you can probably argue that these other arguments about God's existence and the existence of a transcendental order fit most comfortably with Orthodox Christianity than they do with any other religion. So I think there's a combination of things that can be combined. So Vienna asks, Father, in order to establish a monarchy, wouldn't we have to elect a fascist who would forcibly implement the process? It's possible. I really don't know. I mean, I think you can make the point that the Byzantine Empire, for example, was simply, until the 12th century, wasn't really monarchical in the classical sense of the royal authority. Like, for example, the Byzantine Empire, you would have dynasties that would last for maybe 2 or 3 generations and fade off, and then a general would take power through some process that wouldn't be necessarily a revolution. It was kind of like a long-running constitutional dictatorship in which maybe the son or the emperor's great grandson would marry some general, or his third cousin removed would marry some competent military commander who come. For example, the Emperor Justinian, Saint Justinian, his nephew, before the Emperor Saint Justinian was emperor, his uncle had been emperor, and I think his uncle or his great uncle. His uncle was the Emperor Justin. And the Emperor Justin had come from basically nothing. He had been a peasant, illiterate or nearly illiterate, and I presume until he became emperor, or a little bit before that, and he became a soldier in the army in the 480s or something. And he worked his way up and was extremely competent military commander. He became a general, and he became a trusted military commander and advisor of the Emperor Zeno. And so the Emperor Zeno, I can't remember, either he had no heirs or he didn't want to appoint one of his heirs to be a successor. And so he said, well, look, Justin is a very competent man. I'm going to appoint him as my successor, a co-emperor. And then Zeno dies, Justin becomes emperor. Then he finds that his nephew Justinian is also very competent, maybe not as a great military commander, but Emperor Justinian had this ability to see the capacity for others, their talents, and to organize them. And there was a co-monarchy, a co-rulership between Justin and Justinian, and we know how great the reign of Justinian essentially was. I mean, you had the plague of Justinian, the bubonic plague, but that really wasn't his fault. And then Justinian, I think his son becomes emperor, but he doesn't reign for that long. And then there's Tiberius II, and then you have the Emperor Mauritius, who was again a general, I think, who married Tiberius's niece, and so. That's probably a much more complicated question about how you would establish something like that. Okay, so Brandon Thorpe says there was a study published recently that shows that monarchies in the 20th century were more stable and protected private property better than liberal democracies. It was published by Harvard, never mentioned again. There's a French historian whose name I can't remember that argues that the Middle Ages were actually more democratic than we are today. I think that's the French historian. She wrote a lot of books. She wrote one short book called Those Terrible Middle Ages, and I cannot remember her name. And she brings a lot of interesting things up. Depends on what you mean by democratic, I guess. Vienna says, Father, what is your opinion on the Enlightenment? Could you give a bit of analysis on it and why it's flawed? As a rule, everything that came out of the Enlightenment was bad. I don't really see anything good. I mean, I think when I was a teenager, I was into some of this stuff because of the Americanism type stuff, and I think I read some of Montesquieu and Voltaire, and I just, it seemed kind of interesting, but I mean, a lot of it seemed stupid. It dethroned God's place in society. I think that started actually with the Renaissance. Actually, I think you could probably go back before the Renaissance, but I think when it comes to the Enlightenment, the view was that people have the role over the monarch. It produced what's called the liberalism, and by liberalism, we don't really mean what is used in modern American or Canadian discourse of the Liberal Party, or someone whose favors social welfare, or whatever. All political parties in the United States would today be considered liberal, and because they believe the center of society should be the individual, and they believe the purpose of the state is the extension of the rights of the individual, either through maybe a night watchman role where it just it gives negative liberty, or a kind of another role where it gives positive liberty. But the problem is that the purpose of the state, according to the scriptures, is not the individual. It is the promotion of good and the restriction of evil. That's what St. Paul says in Romans 13. So, will the individual benefit from the promotion of good and the restriction of evil? Yes. But it's not done. But the purpose of the state is not to serve your individual interests. It's to promote good and to restrain evil. And then come the interests of the nation, the people, the folk, and then the family, and everything else that comes with that. And of course, the greatest promotion of good is the promotion of orthodoxy. And everything else, I believe, flows from that. Okay, can I give my bit of analysis of why it's flawed? Well, I think it's flawed because it dethrones God. It puts man as the measure of all things. And if God is not the center of society and the center of what the state should strive to promote as good, then what is the state promoting as good? Man, fallen man, man who fell, who's constantly under assault by the demons and the devils, that he should be promoted instead of a sanctified state, sanctified in the name of the Trinity and by the sacraments. Any system, and we've seen what happens with the liberal democracy, the creation of a negative capitalistic order, then reactions to that, and the creation of Marxism, and then just the blood toll of unmitigated horror that followed. Now, that doesn't mean everything that I think that came into the Enlightenment was necessarily a bad. Some of it's, for example, some of it's not necessarily tied to the Enlightenment. For example, some of the stuff about religious toleration, which is a little bit different than religious liberty. If you're talking about not, kind of having an agreement where this group of Protestants is allowed to have their communities, and as long as they don't transgress against the Orthodox state, they can do what they want in their communities. That's more of an arrangement where we don't want to go around killing people. And the Church Fathers didn't want to go around killing people because they were heretics. It didn't mean they thought the heretics should have supreme power in the state. Brendan Thorpe says, if you were living in a monarchy back then, you might have seen your monarch's representative once a year. All local decisions were done communally. That's true. Matthew Thompson says, how accurate was the ancient Greek conception of the monad logos in light of Christian apologetics? I think it was probably not that accurate, since anything that was going to be arrived at, I would say it couldn't be accurate, because anything that was going to be arrived at in pre-Christian times would be at best groping in the dark. There's a sense in which God's grace appears to all men, and he's trying to draw men to himself. And we do have the implanted moral thought and order in us, even though it's been obscured. But we aren't able to reach the revelation of the Holy Trinity apart from divine revelation. God has to tell us these things. But I do not believe they conceived of the Logos as, kind of creating the universe out of nothing. And I believe the problem, as I recall, I haven't read Plato in a very, very long time, but I believe Plato talks about the demiurge. I think that would have been kind of what he thought of as God, and that he didn't believe the demiurge or God had created the universe out of nothing, but there was already unformed matter, so that God was co-eternal with the universe. And of course, that's contrary to a Christian view. And one wonders, if you believe kind of God is co-eternal with the universe and God has a logos through which he forms the eternal matter, if that's the case, how do you, if matter is eternal with God, how is God not? How are they not the same thing? And I think that kind of goes into what almost a form of monism. I think there's all kinds of problems with that. Again, I haven't read a lot of. I used to read some Greek philosophy when I was a teenager, but once I started reading the Church Fathers, I kind of got more and more out of that. I mean, they did have Greek philosophy was discussed in the Church Fathers and a lot, but in the past 10 years, I've been mainly reading historical works, Lives of Saints, and some other. I mean, I could probably next episode I'll probably try to read some more up on the Greek philosophers. But I know Saint Basil did teach that in his discourse to young men that when we deal with the Greek philosophers, we have to only take the good and leave the bad, and whatever is contrary to the gospel is not good. I'm sorry, Matthew, if I can't give it a much more exact answer than that. Father Joseph probably knows a little bit more about this than I do, but I think he had to go to work briefly. Baylord asks, Father, would it be acceptable to start a revolution if the purpose was to overthrow a non-Christian government and install an Orthodox monarchy? I would say no, because how would you? You'd have to have something like a 55% majority Orthodox country to do that. In theory, it sounds like, well, what would happen if you overthrew a communist Marxist dictatorship and an Orthodox dictator took over? Wouldn't that be great? I mean, it'd probably be much better, but, I don't think we live in that necessarily that terrible of a system. And as soon as people begin to ask me, would I be in favor of a violent revolution and we should have a violent revolution, I'm asking, well, why aren't you doing it? Well, not that I want them to do it, but it's always like you're asking someone else to get involved in this stuff when they haven't exhausted all the other possibilities. And generally, as far as I can tell, the fathers and the saints were against revolutions, because a revolution always spins out of control, and even if you have the best wishes, much worse things can come out of that. More incrementalism, I think, would be a better. I mean, of course, there can be extreme circumstances, but I don't really want to go much further in talking about that question. Baylord says, Father, until Tsar Alexander II, most of Russia were serfs, somewhat slaves. If we had an absolute monarchy, we could have a Kim Jong-un type character, and we wouldn't be able to resist. Okay, well, Alexander II, most of the Russia were serfs. I'm not sure what the problem with that was. It wasn't great, I guess, to be a serf, but serfdom really came in a much more serious way under Peter the Great. And that was due to westernizing influences. But there are also other explanations you can bring in. But still, I would, not support democracy. And as bad as North Korea is, I mean, they have a lot of bad stuff going on there, but they're, Okay, speaking of not wanting to kill heretics, why did Orthodoxy never have inquisitions, even against groups like Bogomil's Novgorod Judaizers? Well, I think this goes back to what St. Martin of Tours was talking about. When the Priscillian heresy started came about in Spain in the late 4th century, Priscillianism was basically a kind of combination of like weird astrology with esotericism, and combined with Christianity. And it kind of spread, and there was a council of bishops, and they appealed to the Emperor Maximum. And Maximian, I believe, was kind of this counter-emperor who some people thought was a legitimate emperor. He ruled like Britain and Gaul and parts of Septimania and such, in parts of Spain. Some of the bishops thought, well, this is bad, this is terrible. Priscillian has to be executed, and we have to go through all the Spanish churches and to root out all the Priscillians by violent means to find out, because the Priscillians believed in like mental reservation. St. Augustine talks about this, how they would say they believed in not telling you what they really believed. They would simply just lie about things. And so some people reason, well, then you have to start torturing people to find out what they believe. And St. Martin of Tours absolutely said no. St. Martin of Tours was against the execution of Priscillian. The execution of Priscillian was condemned by all the saints of the day. And St. Martin said that if you try to enforce an inquisition in Hispania or Gaul or Italy or whatever, kind of like torturing people to find out who's really Priscillian, you're going to end up killing more Orthodox and torturing more of the Orthodox than you are going to be finding the heretics. So generally we did not, I mean, there were ways the church could do this by simply just preaching the gospel. And now, of course, if they're open heretics, they're excommunicated. You're really talking about trying to find secret heretics, because if they're a secret heretic, clergy don't really have a lot of power to know who's really a heretic or not. I don't think we had really ever an Inquisition. There was basically there was a large scale execution of Paulicians in the 850s, but that was less an Inquisition than more of a punishment against them for rebelling against the Byzantine Empire. I think there was some sort of, when we talk about Inquisition, if we just mean a committee or group of clergy and laity going to different churches and questioning the people and saying what they believe, that's not an Inquisition, at least in the way we popularly think of it. That's simply just an investigation. By Inquisition, people generally mean putting you on a rack and torturing you until you tell them what you really believe or telling them what you want. I think in the case of the Bogomils and the Judaizers, I don't know if Inquisition would have actually helped, because, again, how are you going to figure out what someone really believes? If you believe this person is a Bogomil or is a Judaizer and they deny they are, and you torture them for 2-3 hours, and then eventually they say yes, do they really say yes because they are that, or do they say yes because they wanted the torture to stop? So there are other ways. So Vienna says, Father, would it be more moral or immoral to invade Saudi Arabia right now, since they're not allowing non-Sunni faiths? What about North Korea too? Well, let's save some of that for the Orthodoxy versus Everyone Forum. That's going to be on Thursday. That's kind of a different question. But just save that question. Brendan Thorpe says, kind of ironic that Britain and Russia freed their slaves and serfs and did it peacefully. Okay. Bait Lord says, what verses talk about hesychasm in the Bible? Well, I suppose you would talk about pray unceasingly. St. Paul talks about that, and that is in Ephesians, I believe. The computer is slow tonight, so forgive me for I have some problems with my Linux here. Pray unceasingly. I believe that is in Ephesians. I'm looking that up right now. 1 Thessalonians. Rejoice always. Pray without ceasing. Giving thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God. All right? So that would be an example. How do you pray without ceasing? Well, the prayer of the heart. Pray without ceasing. If there are any more Bible verses. I think you find in the book of Psalms, there's a lot of talk about meditating always on the commandments of the Lord, for example, in the 119th Psalm. So, I guess someone's going to argue that's not hesychasm, and I suppose what do they mean by hesychasm? Do they mean the actual physical techniques of setting down, putting your chin in your chest, and breathing techniques? Those aren't necessary for hesychasm, for the prayer of the heart. They can be used or not used depending upon what the spiritual father finds out and what's decided. But the concept of unceasing prayer, I think you do find in the scriptures by praying unceasingly, as St. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, and in Psalm 119 by meditating day and night upon the statutes of the Lord. Is torture ever right, Father? I think I'm going to go on a limb and say probably in some circumstances. It was used in medieval laws by the Code of Justinian. I think there's probably some limited circumstances that you could in fact use it. That's my opinion. Someone can say, no, Father, you're wrong about this. But I suppose as a punishment, you could torture somebody, like if they molested and raped a lot of children. Putting them on a rack and stretching them out in public, I probably wouldn't be too much opposed to that. Should I try converting my cat to Orthodoxy? What about an invading alien? Okay, well, obviously animals don't have souls, Bait Lord. So you can't convert your cat to Orthodoxy. About invading aliens, I don't believe there are extraterrestrial mortal creatures. You're dealing with either angels or demons. And you can't convert demons. Oh, please, could I? No, I'm not going to answer the question about Saudi Arabia. I need to. Let me start answering the questions I was sent through Facebook. Okay. All right. Okay. 1. What are your reviews on contemporary psychology, psychiatry, and medicinal prescriptions for mental illness? For obvious reasons, I'm very skeptical that one can speak insightfully on the human mind or prescribe something that ultimately heals without having an orthodox anthropology. Well, I think Father Joseph would agree with me here, and I think many others, and I would agree with you, Basil, who sent me these questions. I don't know if you're asking them or someone's asking them for you, or wanting you to ask them, but I think you probably can have there. I would go on a limb and say there probably is some use to some psychiatric drugs if there is a sincere and honest physical, chemical, mental imbalance in the brain, because the fathers and the medievals did in fact believe that you could have what's called imbalance in the humors. That could in fact affect your decision-making power, because they realized that if someone got knocked on the head really bad, and if they recovered, their personality changes, or they, can't add correctly, or they kind of realized there was some interaction between the physical and the mental. So if somebody has some kind of serious brain tumor, or parts of their brain are missing, or there is some major chemical problem, and it's going to be much more harmful not to use medicine than to use a chemical drug. I would say it is allowable to use a chemical drug in those restricted circumstances. Now, the other problem is to what extent are prescriptions of antidepressants, is there an overprescription? I would agree that's probably an obvious case where they just give antidepressants and antipsychotics out like candy, and because they just want to medicate and drug everybody, and that hides the problem. You never really solve your problem. It's like, for example, having a gastric bypass surgery. And I know there are people who are like a 600-pound life and 700 who've gotten so bad that they may want to change their life, but they've gotten out of control, and maybe they have to have some kind of surgery. But unless it's some extreme case, just getting stomach reduction, and even those people who get the stomach reduction who are like 800 pounds, if they don't end up following the rules, they don't change what's with them psychologically in their own sense. They're just masking over a problem. They're going to gain the weight back. So psychiatry, I don't know if anybody else agrees with me, but I have a strange, bad feeling about a lot of psychiatry. I've known some psychiatrists, and some of them were interesting people. Some of them are creepy. Some of them were just regular doctors who, I guess got into the field and weren't that terrible. The better ones I have, talked to, not that I wasn't going to one, but the ones I have talked to simply just gave good advice, I thought, that could have been given by someone in the community who was an elder or a priest who was well-trained. So I agree. If you're just looking for a chemical solution to what are spiritual and emotional problems, I think you're not going to really solve anything, and you're just going to make things worse in the end. Okay. Second question, and before I go back to the chat, would be, what should the role of women be in the church and in daily life? How should men and women relate to one another? Can men and women be friends? And why have most abandoned segregating men and women in the church? The role of women in the church in daily life. Well, obviously, women can't be clergy. It's not that we don't allow them; they just can't be clergy. Even in the history of the church, when they talk about these deaconesses, deaconesses were not clergy, not in the way we think of it, at the very least. You never had women readers, nor did you have women subdeacons. And in the West, they never had people given clerical tonsure and made women doorkeepers and exorcists and acolytes. That never happened. The deaconess, just to address this question, was a special order. Generally, you had to be over, I think, according to the canons of Chalcedon, you had to be over 40 or 45. You had to, in some cases, be celibate. You had to be a virgin. You could never have been married. They had a lot of restrictions. They didn't have they weren't reading litanies, nor were they singing the gospel. Their main goal was to help with the baptism of women, since people were baptized in the ancient period and until relatively recently in the nude. And even when infants are baptized in the church, they're baptized without any clothing on, as a rule. Their other role of the women deaconesses was simply to, if they were in a monastic community, they could take communion to a sick sister if the priest couldn't get there. but they had no liturgical roles. So the role of women in the church, much like in a proper society, is to support their husband, is to help take care of the children, to help take care of the house, the home, to submit to the husband in all things that are good. Obviously, the husband can't command them to commit sin or evil or anything like that, and everybody should recognize that. Basically, the role we saw for women before modern society, even before, I guess, the 1920s, before you had all the Edward Bernays stuff about women need to be smoking and they need to vote and all this other stuff. And we've created an imbalance. Women, certainly should pray. They stay on their side of the church, which is the women's side, the Theotokos side, which is the left side of the church, and men stay on their side, which is the right side of the church. Women have their role in the home, which is the taking care of the home, taking care of the children, helping their husband, and men have their role, which is primarily should be that of working, leading the household, making important decisions. Of course, the husband should listen to his wife. He should, not be taking because the scriptures in the book of Proverbs say a good king, takes advice from his counselors. So even though the husband has the final decision, the wife should give advice, and but the husband has the primary role in that. How should men and women relate to one another? Well, they should relate in the case of marriage. The husband is the leader and the wife is the helper. And they should work together as a team, but there is a team leader, and that is the husband. Now, in the wider society, my belief personally is I think that as soon as they started getting out of having women wear some sort of head covering outside of church, even though that kind of happens even in traditional Orthodox countries today, that kind of was a symbol of some of the bad changes. All this stuff about men and women mixing together in social environments, that's I think a 19th century thing that began to happen. I mean, yeah, maybe began to happen during the 17th century when they began to have all these different balls and people dancing together and such. But if you read some of their canons by the fathers, a lot of them are against dancing. The clergy aren't supposed to dance. I can tell you that. That's in the canons of Antioch and Ancyra. If a clergyman, if I performed a marriage and I'm at a wedding, and then at the wedding they start to have dancing, I have to leave. That's in fact what's specified in the canons, and I don't believe there should be dancing at weddings and such, and I don't think men and women should dance together. That sounds extreme, but that was actually a normative opinion into even the non-Orthodox world until relatively recently. I think there should be segregated communities for men and women in the sense of colleges. Obviously, they're going to live together in homes if they're husband and wife. But I mean, women should have their sphere of society, and men should have their sphere, and they should be cooperative, not antagonistic to each other. All this antagonism has been brought in by feminism, which has tried to disrupt the natural order. And that brought in co-ed colleges and then co-ed schools and all, and women in the workplace, where there should have been a segregation between the sexes to avoid some of the problems that later came about. And the other part is why have most abandoned segregating men and women in church? I at least in my synod, we haven't abandoned that. I think that again, in those places where that has happened, that's again probably 19th century, late and mid 19th century Protestantism where that started, and it spread. And anything where you see men and women if men and women are sitting together in church, that is something that came out of Protestantism, 19th century Protestantism, and then infected papism, and then got into Orthodoxy, basically probably the 60s or something like that, through things like St. Vladimir's and St. Seminary and all the other modernist institutions that wanted to make themselves look more like American Protestantism. And then they brought in the pew. And I think, once you start bringing in the pews into church, you're going to have a problem no matter what. So I think there should be separate roles for men and women in society. It doesn't mean women are treated like dirt. That's not true. But they have their role in taking care of the children. The husband has to also take care of the children. That's true. But everybody kind of knows the traditional roles that we had until relatively recently, into kind of the Masonic and women's liberation, the Bolsheviks, even I would say, dare say, Jewish influence started corrupting a lot of these things, even though, and that caused a lot of destruction. Okay, so let me go back to the chat real quick. And before I go into the next question, see if there are any questions worthy of being answered. I hate to say it like that. Let's see. Can you analyze Matthew 16:18 for us? And I believe that, if I'm not mistaken, that is, I tell you that thou art Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Well, what's the rock? What happened before Peter, our Lord said this to St. Peter? Well, our Lord asked, who do men say that I am? And some of the apostles gave answers like, oh, you're one of the prophets, etc. John the Baptist risen again. And then St. Peter, under divine inspiration, said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Christ said, blessed art thou, Peter. And why was he building the church? Why? On what gates? What are the church? Well, he's building the church on the gates of the confession of the Son of God. So, to me, the rock is the confession of faith. Even if you find some fathers that kind of give a secondary meaning of Peter as the rock, he is the rock because of the confession of the faith. So his rockiness depends upon the confession of Christ as the Son of the living God, which, in other words, is the correct confession, the Orthodox confession of faith. Okay. Nigel Farage, I guess I doubt that's the real Nigel Farage, says, what is the Eucharist like in Orthodoxy? Don't you eat soup in the Orthodox Eucharist? Because I saw it eaten with a spoon. Well, what you probably saw was that it's been common custom in most of Orthodoxy for probably 900 years, I would at least 900 years, that when communion is given through the method called intinction. Intinction is when you take a piece of the body and dip it in the blood. And the safest way most have seen to do this is simply to use a spoon and to take the pieces of the body that have been put into the chalice and to dole them out with a spoon. So it wouldn't be soup, but it's for more of a safety concern. I think it's actually the safest way. Now, what's true in Western Rite Orthodoxy, proper Western Rite Orthodoxy, communion is given through intinction, and in some cases is given with a spoon. It is allowed, especially if you don't have a deacon to hold the chalice. But it's mainly a safety concern. And the church long ago, probably by the 5th century or the 6th century, gave up giving the body of the Lord directly into people's hands. That happened centuries before the schism. Because basically people could carry off the body and not consume it and do all kinds of weird stuff with it they shouldn't be doing. So your purpose is to take the body, that's taking communion. Using a spoon is, I think, especially if you don't have a deacon to hold the chalice, if you are like a Western Rite Orthodox like I am to do intinction, that you have to use a spoon. Vienna says, is it true that the Vatican Jesuits find has helped the Jewish Bolshevik Revolution? Yes, that's true. So I don't even think that is anybody really questioning that that's actually what happened now. Nigel asks, is it immoral to have an ethno-state, taking into consideration the fact that other races weaken social cohesion and eventually cause violent tribalism? Again, we've talked about this on every single program, and it seems like everybody asks it. Father Joseph has his own. I don't disagree with Father Joseph. I kind of give my own variant on the reply, and my reply would be that from the canons of the Orthodox Church and from the scriptures, from the fathers, I can't see a reason why it would be inherently immoral. But what I consistently say is this, is that whether one has a ethno-state or a civil national state, if the purpose of that state is not the promotion of good and the restriction of evil, and the primary purpose is not that of Orthodox Christianity, if it's just a secular philosophy, whether it's secular civil nationalism or secular ethno-nationalism, if that's the purpose, then eventually they don't have a real reason. Because, you're going to last for hundreds and hundreds of years just talking about atheism, and that's going to be your state philosophy, even if you're, racial materialists. No, that's not going to work. I think Orthodoxy has to be the primary focus, and whatever type of state is formed. Or at least you have to have, even if it's not an Orthodox state, you have to have some sort of, even if it's a heterodox foundation, even if it's some sort of heterodox Christian foundation, that's better than simple atheism. What does the Orthodox Church teach about women's suffrage? I don't know if there's actually a decree by any synod that actually has. Now, I could be wrong. If somebody knows, please correct me. I would simply be against it because I don't think anything positive has come about because of it. That's just my opinion. I think it probably smacks against the traditional order. And if you're going to allow women to vote, why? Then they have to be. Then they're going to be equal in that stage. Why not allow them to be drafted? That's we know where all that goes. It's there's supposedly the view is that there's equality between the sexes. Then they're as if they're interchangeable organisms, which is not true. So I can't say the Orthodox Church has an official ecumenical council or even mass attended local council against women's suffrage. I might be incorrect there. In fact, could be some statement by the Russian Orthodox Church prior to the revolution that was against it in any sense, like in local elections. And if it is, someone please bring that up. But I would say we're generally against it. But the fact is, it is here, and I think it still can be used in a positive direction. And in places where they have had, like, for example, pro-life referendums, I will say that a lot of pro-life activists are women and have done a lot of good work and have helped restrict abortion and the killing of children. So I can't say it's entirely evil, but I think it's symptomatic of the larger problem of having a mass liberal democracy. I think that's the larger problem. Vienna asks, what part of the Old Testament do we follow or not follow because God tells the Jews not to interbreed with other races? Okay, so to answer the second question, that's technically not true. People bring that up. But if you look in Exodus and Deuteronomy, for example, the Jews are in fact allowed to marry an Egyptian after that Egyptian has had like the second or third generation with being inside the community, having converted. But I think, for example, the Ammonites are never allowed to stand in the congregation of the Lord, even after they converted. They have to stand outside of it. Now, that's interesting because technically the Ammonites are much more closely related to the Israelites than the Egyptians. The Egyptians were a Hamitic race. And, the Israelites were just as much related to the Egyptians as they were to, the Greeks or to the Celts. So I have never seen that, nor I think you can see there is an ethnic component to it. Yes, in the sense that I hate to use the word Jews because they weren't really the Jews during the time of Moses. It was the Israelites. The Israelites were basically the only people worshiping the true God, and that was always an iffy situation because they'd apostatize a lot. The parts of the Old Testament we follow and do not follow, whatever has not been superseded or overturned or fulfilled by the New Testament. So, for example, the dietary restrictions, except for the eating of blood, that's actually goes back to the time of Noah. In Acts 15, the Apostolic Council and the Apostolic Canons and the Council of Antioch and Ancyra still continue to forbid the eating of blood. That goes beyond Mosaic and Jewish rules. So things like the dietary laws, clean and unclean foods, animal sacrifice, things about how to exactly manage, the size of the measurements of, how much is a hekel or a shekel or something like that. Some of those laws, a large portion of those laws, what you call ceremonial laws, and some of and that was prescribed distinctly for the Israelite community. Now, some of them may in fact be good laws. For example, the Jubilee of every 50 years of freeing debt, that goes beyond even the Israelites. So you have to distinguish between what's called the ceremonial law and things like the moral law, like thou shalt do no murder. So whatever the commandments that are repeated in the New Testament, those are kept, while the regulations and rules distinct to the Jewish dispensation, like you can't eat pigs, you can't eat shellfish, you have to sacrifice animals. Those were done away with the sacrifice of Christ and the founding of the New Testament church. Okay. So, I mean, oftentimes people will bring up stuff about, well, the Old Testament says you can't wear two garments of, different, form or something like that. I can't remember quite what it is. And, that's a distinct Old Testament prohibition for, probably typological reasons. For example, why did God say that? Why were pigs prohibited from being eaten instead of other creatures? Well, a lot of the creatures God prohibited from eating they were bottom feeding animals. There was probably a lot of health regulation in there. There were probably all kinds of other reasons, like how the Israelites and the surrounding people viewed the swine, etc. So a lot of this stuff about, well, it says in the Old Testament, for example, this oftentimes comes up when you deal with people who will attack the church because we say that homosexuality is evil. And they'll say, well, it also prohibits eating a shellfish in the Old Testament. And they think they've discovered something new, and they've not listened to anything anyone's been saying for 2,000 years. If you cannot recognize that the eating a shellfish is different than a moral law prohibiting, infertile, barren, contrary to nature, so-called, sexual behavior, then something's happened to your brain. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but there is ceremonial law and there are moral laws. All right, and there's a difference between those two things. Even in the Orthodox Church, you might call the ceremonial law every now and again differs. For example, the liturgy as celebrated by St. John Chrysostom will not look exactly like the liturgy as celebrated by a priest using the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom exactly today. It may have general characteristics. 90% of it may be the same, but a lot of it may not be. Okay, so let me go back to the chat questions. The chat questions. How should Orthodoxy address ethnicity in America? That almost seems like it should be an Orthodoxy versus everyone question. My dogs are barking, sorry. But I think the proper way is different ethnic groups should respect each other. The Orthodox answer is all the ethnic groups should become Orthodox. They are going to be primary. Once you become Orthodox, you are a brother or sister, even if you're a different race or ethnic group. That does not mean necessarily the abolition of your group, but it does mean hatred between groups has to end. I think that's people oftentimes quote the 1870 rule against ethnophiletism, and I think sometimes people go to different extremes where one, they reject it entirely, because I guess the Ecumenical Patriarchate treated the Bulgarians very badly, and that's true. And the other extreme is to say, that it means you can't even be happy. You can't even be happy you're an Anglo-Saxon, you have that heritage, or that you're a Caucasian European, or that you're Mestizo or Japanese or whatever. But it's not addressing that. That's not what it's saying. It's saying you cannot have ethnic supremacism within the church, which in fact the Ecumenical Patriarchate is now violating its own decree by teaching that the Hellenic race somehow has the supremacy in the Ecumenical Patriarchate and should have it naturally. So there should be respect between ethnic and racial groups. If they become part of the Orthodox Church, they should have brotherhood among each other. And there's going to be a certain sense in which ethnicism, there's certain types of ethnicism that are not going to be acceptable. For example, who is more my brother in the true sense, which is the spiritual sense, the sub-Saharan Black African who was an Orthodox Christian and who devoutly follows the Orthodox faith, or let's say a cousin of mine, or another relative who is definitely the same race and closer blood than any other members of the same race, but they're not Orthodox and they're an atheist. That sub-Saharan African Orthodox person has a closer affinity. Why? Because we both take the body and blood of our Lord in the Eucharist, and we're part of the same body. Now that doesn't stop him from being a sub-Saharan African and me being 99.9% English. All right, that doesn't end that no more than a man and a woman who are not related at all and they're both Orthodox. When St. Paul says in Christ there's neither Greek nor Jew, male nor female, that doesn't mean those distinctions don't physically still exist. It means the primary focus of our life should be that of Christ. And I think people often on different sides of this whole discussion, go far overboard and try to make everything about ethnos. On the other hand, they try to make nothing about ethnos. And the proper role, I think, is moderation, and it's charity to everyone. And a lot of people, both the ethnic supremacist and the person who believes in supposed ethnic egalitarianism, and the kind of like Marxist or the weird Antifa type people, they both don't understand it, and they want to. If those people try to get into the Orthodox Church, and if they try to bring their own philosophies with them, they end up, if they don't learn to change or to moderate heavily how they view the world, then they end up leaving Orthodoxy. And we have to do a better job of explaining what is the proper Orthodox position on this, including away things that are detritus, that are not necessarily part of it, and what is the core to be focused on. And, I know a lot of people won't be happy with that answer, but I think that's the proper answer. What is the Orthodox position on warfare and St. Augustine's conditions for just war? I think we answered this before. We accept there being a just war. As far as I can tell, in the Christian Roman Empire, and then in the West and in the East, and the Eastern Empire continued up into 1453, theoretically, even though it was kind of a city-state with a few places in Greece by 1453. And in the Russian Empire, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the Empire, war was accepted. Soldiers were allowed to fight in war. There were prayers, masses, liturgy, services sung for the preservation of the emperor and the army. You're defending the homeland and your people were certainly accepted. Genocidal wars, just going and killing people, raping and murdering, that's not allowed. A just war has to be for a just cause. And a just cause is it in line with the moral order? For example, hold on one second. Andy, give me that bottle. Sorry, one of my dogs had something shouldn't. For example, the Russian Empire. Okay, one of the things that stopped the Ottomans from massacring the Orthodox population, or or at least not massacring them, but violating their traditional rights they had assumed, and and destroying their churches and other things more than the Ottomans did, was the threat that the Ottoman Empire. It was the threat that the Russian Empire posed to them. And this was because the czars would, every time the Ottoman sultans tried to threaten the Christian population, would say, if you do this, you're breaking the pact, either an actual on-paper treaty we have, and the Russian Navy would simply attack the Ottoman Empire. And eventually the Ottomans learned it was much easier not to harshly persecute the Christian population, or at least be very selective in their persecutions, than to do anything than not. So that's an example of a just war. I think you could probably argue the Russian liberation of Bulgaria back in the 1870s was a just war. Even though the Bulgarians later got taken over by kind of a government that didn't really represent the interests of Bulgarian Orthodox, and of course they fought on the side of the Axis and betrayed Orthodox Russia. Although you could think that's a more complicated question there. So we do accept the concept of a just war. There's no problem in Orthodoxy with that. You have all these Orthodox peace fellowship and so-called in-communion people who say that there is no such thing as just war in Orthodoxy, but they must not be reading how the saints have traditionally reacted. What is true is that Saint Basil says in one of his canons that our fathers did not account killing in warfare to be murder, to be unjust killing. But St. Basil says, nevertheless, I recommend, a 3-year penance or abstention from communion for soldiers coming back. So even in that case, St. Basil is not making it a rule that the soldiers have to do a 3-year penance upon coming back. Now, the question is, why would St. Basil give a 3-year penance to soldiers in the Roman army coming back after, let's say, fighting the Persians? Well, because unfortunately, there's probably all kinds of things that you could have done, even accidentally, in warfare. If you're in a battle, if you're attacking a city in the ancient world, even in the modern world, there's really going to be, even if you're going to be as careful as possible, you're probably going to end up killing people, who shouldn't be killed. And you may say, well, I didn't fire the catapult. I didn't mean to do this. But, I think St. Basil's view was just in case. And the fact that we cannot treat killing and warfare as a normative thing. There is a great sense in which defending your homeland is very wonderful and great and beautiful. But the way in which it's done by warfare is to be considered a necessary evil. Now, by necessary evil, I don't mean a moral evil. In the scriptures, God says in the book of Isaiah, I believe that it says, I am the Lord, I create good and I create evil, dark and light. He's not talking about creating good and evil in a moral sense, or a dark and light in a moral sense. What God is talking about in the scriptures when he says those things is that, let's say, a tsunami or an earthquake, that is an evil in the sense of an occurrence that it's evil to us physically, all right? But an earthquake is not morally evil. So when a soldier defends the fatherland, the homeland, the motherland, he's having to do this, and he may be very happy that he's defending his family, but this should not become so much a part of his being. Killing should not become a fundamental. He should not try to assimilate that to be a fundamental part of his being. And so St. Basil suggests some sort of penance be given so that he understands this. Okay, let me just go through these other questions that was sent through Facebook. But my point is that there is a just war in Orthodoxy. How to determine a just war, that's more complicated. And my own opinion was that probably hardly any wars fought by the major Western powers in the past 80 years have been just. That's just my opinion. And that probably shows you that the more society becomes distinct from traditional, monarchical, traditional Christian principles, and it becomes more, involved into capital and wealth and the promotion of, the kind of this contrary Enlightenment order, that warfare takes on an increasingly different dimension. It's always been brutal. There's always been terrible things and always been illegitimate wars. But I think it's just something has happened in the past 200 years. And I think I know what it was. Okay, so how should an Orthodox layman react to scandal in the church? Well, first off, when scandal happens in the church, let's say, for example, example, in Romania, so this is sufficiently far back that maybe people can think of it in a more objective sense. In Romania in the 1860s, the Jerusalem Patriarchate, through the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre, which was kind of the Greek brotherhood that frankly illegally took over the Patriarchate of Jerusalem and created an uncanonical monopoly on it, it had metochia, and it had monasteries and lands it controlled in Romania. And it did the same throughout everywhere. Now, you can read St. Raphael Hawawini, who wrote a book against the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre. And he was trying to be fair, but there were a lot of terrible things they did. And so what happened was that the so-called abbot, he was, technically an abbot, he was made an abbot of this Jerusalem Patriarchate Metochian monastery in Romania, was in fact exposed for sexually molesting the Romanian village children who were going there with their parents to the Jerusalem Patriarchate monastery in Romania, and the Metochion, because it's also Jerusalem Patriarchate, they got all these relics. And this abbot ended up sexually abusing the children. And, how did the people react? Well, did the people leave Orthodoxy? No. Now, thankfully, they had a lot easier recourse because they complained to the, I think, the Prince of Wallachia at the time. And the prince and his boyars and the church authorities said, look, you're Metochion. Maybe we can't technically depose you because you're not under our authority. But they did strip the land from them. And they did put this... this abbot on a boat, and when they wanted to imprison him or give him a worse punishment, they sent him back to Jerusalem. But the lay people there, the Romanian people in the 1860s, realized that this man who was a priest and an abbot, even though he was a true priest and his sacraments were true because the Holy Ghost does the sacraments, his actions were not the actions of Christ. And they did not give up believing in God, the Holy Trinity, our Savior, the sacraments, because of this evil man who happened to be in the holy orders. So the proper way to react is to, one, expose the scandal. If there's a true scandal, it needs to be exposed, it needs to be purged from the church. All right? It's just not to be quiet and just say, oh, well, maybe it'll go away after 10 or 20 or 30, 40, 50 years. All right. So don't leave the church because of a scandal. Don't lose faith because of a scandal. Fight against the evil that's in there. All right. Because if you just assume, oh, well, it'll be taken care of, it may never be taken care of, or for a very long time. And then they get worse and worse. So the best reaction is to keep faith and to fight against it and to expose it. Okay, that's what I believe the best way to deal with it. Okay, so the Facebook questions. The sixth question is, what is heresy? Precisely speaking, should contemporary descendants of heretics be considered heretics? Father Seraphim Rose had said that contemporary Protestants aren't willfully in error, so they should not be called heretics. What are they called? I believe that was a question asked to Father Seraphim in a letter. There was like a black woman who mailed him a letter and asked him about this. And Father Seraphim says, look, in a certain way, you're correct. That's why often we say heterodox. But technically, the church still has called them, even in the Council of Trullo, it talks about the Monophysite heretics. Even the Monophysites have been heretics for a while, up to that period, 240 some odd years or so. All right. So you can still call them heretics, but it may be a little bit more, I use the word politique to say heterodox.
I think
Father Joseph's back. So did you hear the question I read out?
Yeah, I did. I think it's kind of a distinction without a difference.
Yes.
I think people really want to really make a distinction between heretics and heterodox because it makes them feel like there's less of a personal guilt and they're not being offensive. If you're saying someone doesn't have the right belief, they're going to get offended.
I'm saying I think what Father Seraphim was saying was that if I say, Mama, you're a heretic, as opposed to the Mama, you're heretic, you have a heterodox belief.
Yeah, both of those are going to insult your mom.
Well, I know, but a lot of people may think the word heretic sounds heterodox, although it's the exact same word. It sounds less bad. I guess that's the idea. I mean, I'm not going to attack Father Seraphim Rose for preferring heterodox over heretic.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's accurate to say that. Yeah, they're not willfully in error, but technically, when Protestantism started, none of them had been born Orthodox to begin with. Martin Luther wasn't born Orthodox. The people in the West hadn't been Orthodox for at least 400 years by that time.
Yeah, well, I think that there's got to be some level of culpability. Protestantism, almost in general, considers acceptance of Christ within the age of reason, but it's like a very, very distorted sense of Christ. So, in the sense that guilt can't be imputed because they don't have the correct doctrine of Christ. I don't know.
But they're still teaching error. Where the concept of they're not guilty of it. Yeah, I mean, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses. Did the Jehovah's Witness who may have come to your door 6 months ago, Father? He didn't invent Arianism, obviously.
No, but he still believes in it fully.
Exactly. He's still guilty of Arianism, and even though I think Son John Chrysostom talked about this in a sermon that the heresiarch at the judgment. Heresiarchs will be judged much harsher than the people generations later who followed their heresy. They will still be judged, and they still won't find salvation. They die in heresy.
Go ahead.
But my point is that they're both, but the punishments are going to be different. The difference between a man. You see what St. John Chrysostom is saying in that sense, all right? There is a distinction between the heresiarch and the person 10 generations later who follows his heresy. In the sense that the heresiarch was an apostate from Orthodoxy. Completely.
Well, yeah.
How St. Peter says that in his first or second Peter, that it would have been better for the people who become Orthodox and leave the church that if they had never believed to begin with, because your judgment's going to be much worse than your judgments in hell. And hell's going to be much worse than the heretic who is born into a heresy and dies in it. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, well, I'm not disagreeing with you there, but my personal pet peeve is the fact that most of the time when people have corrected me, and I put that in quotes and said, you don't mean heretic, you mean heterodox. It's because they don't want to call heretics heretics. In all honesty, that's really what it comes down to. And I don't think that wasn't Father Seraphim's intent, but it's certainly the intent of so many ecumenists that I've met.
Yes. No, I agree. And it may be at the point where trying to be nice with saying heterodox is just useless. We should just call everybody who's not Orthodox a heretic at this point, because otherwise we're giving in to kind of the psychology they're trying to promote. Okay, this Mr. Nigel asks, why was Arianism praised in one of the Orthodox councils? Well, Arianism was never praised in one of the Orthodox councils. I would ask, what Orthodox council praised Arianism?
Yeah, I'm curious.
The first ecumenical council anathematized Arianism. The second ecumenical council anathematized Arianism. In fact, all of the ecumenical councils anathematized Arianism. So I would say not the local councils, they all condemned Arianism. I would ask, what of the local councils praised Arianism? Now, there are heretical councils that were held in the 4th century by Arian bishops that praised Arianism, but those aren't Orthodox councils. Okay, Logos Apologia says, how did Islam manage to defeat a Christendom that owned the whole of Europe, North and East Africa, and a huge percentage of Middle East, Syria, Iraq, Palestine? Was God against us? Was it a curse? I think St. John Damascene and others do kind of view it as a curse. For example, remember, a lot of some of the saints, like St. Maximus, I believe, and maybe St. John Damascene, I think St. John Damascene, but maybe St. Maximus would say that, one, the authorities that controlled the Byzantine Empire, both ecclesiastically and religiously during the Islamic invasion, were not Orthodox. They were Monothelites. In fact, they were persecuting the Orthodox in Rome and in Greece and everywhere else under the Monothelite emperors. So, first off, there is a spiritual reality that when a country, a nation, a government turns away from the true faith and begins to persecute its members, that you can't have, and then bad things begin to happen. You can't say, oh, woe is me. Okay. So secondly, there's actually another reason I think you can combine with that, is that the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, had essentially been in essentially a 40-year-long war with the Persian Empire before the Islamic invasions in the 630s. There had been a 20-year war that from, I think, the 560s to the 580s between the Byzantines and the Eastern Roman Byzantines and the Persians, which was fought throughout the Caucasus areas. And they fought to a standstill. The Byzantines and the Persians were like the superpowers. They could fight each other to a standstill, but they were never able to really conquer, to hold each other's territory. There was a peace agreement reached in the 580s, I believe, by the Emperor Mauritius, who was a general, who I think had married the cousin or the second cousin of the previous emperor and became emperor after that guy died. And he reached an agreement. I think one of the Emperor Mauritius's relatives, I think the Emperor Mauritius' niece married the Persian emperor. And so he became the nephew of the uncle of the Persian emperor, and they actually had very good relations between the Emperor Mauritius in the Persian Empire. Emperor Mauritius is killed. The killer was a man named Phocas, who was a Middle Eastern general of the Imperial Army in the Middle East, because there was a lot of antagonism to the Emperor Mauritius because of his supposed connections to the Persians and his peace policy. Phocas came to power. I don't think he ever claimed to have killed Mauritius. Everybody kind of knew it was an open secret, but they legally couldn't prove it. It's one of those things. Phocas immediately launches a war, an ill-planned out war against the Persians. And surprisingly, the Persians began to defeat the Byzantine army in battle after battle after battle. Phocas, some scholars may believe, was a good tactical commander in an individual battle, but he had no real tact for large strategic planning. And I think he also began to kill a lot of people in the state who he felt were loyal to the old emperor. And this resulted in the Persians conquering most of North Africa up into Libya. I think they definitely conquered Egypt. The Persians conquered Palestine. They conquered Mesopotamia. All of Mesopotamia. They conquered all of Asia Minor. They conquered Syria, Lebanon, I think the Transjordan, all those areas. The Byzantine Empire at that point got reduced to, Constantinople, its Balkan possessions, Greece, and the western half of North Africa and parts of Italy. All right, and that was protected because the Persians just couldn't get that far. And there was a big battle at Constantinople. The Persians had allied, I believe, with the Slavic pagan tribes, the Avars and others. And they made this joint attack on Constantinople. It was never able to really coordinate. The Persians had expected to have a quick victory, but as anyone attacking the walls of Constantinople knows, that's not going to happen. Winter sets in. The Persians have to retreat. The Emperor Heraclius, at that time, the governor of Africa was a man named Heraclius. Governor General was Heraclius, and his son was called Heraclius. They had never sworn allegiance to Phocas because I believe they regarded Mauritius as the legitimate murdered emperor. They are able to send an army that arrives at Constantinople, deposes Phocas, and executes him. And at that point, Heraclius is able to gradually take back everything. So when a peace treaty is finally reached with the Persians in, I don't know, 632 or so, or 633, and there's kind of a status quo antebellum. Both sides have been exhausted in a massive war, and two gigantic massive wars between each other for 20 years. All right, so at that point, reasonably, the last thing the authorities either in Persia or in Constantinople are thinking is a gigantic, fanatic, new religion Arab army bursting out of hundreds of thousands of horsemen and fanatic soldiers, maybe over 1 million, bursting out and invading their weakened territories. All right? So I think you can attribute it, one, to the fact I think there's a good deal of judgment of God against it. Two, that can be combined with the fact that the Byzantine Empire had been engaged in massive warfare and that's why the Persians got conquered also. All right? And the Byzantines actually did much better than the Persians by keeping their empire alive. North Africa had basically been ravaged, people forget this, by the Vandals having invaded and conquered in the 400s, and then there being constant battles. Then the Emperor Justinian's armies having to fight the Vandals over and over again in North Africa. And then there basically being... North Africa didn't just surrender in one battle to begin with. Throughout the 630s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s, the Roman army and the locals who were allied with it were consistently fighting a massive, drawn-out, village to village, city to city, valley to valley battle with the Muslims. It wasn't just like, we're going to retreat. They were actually fighting them continuously. One of the problems, though, and this is all multifaceted, is the Byzantine Empire was extremely well spread out. I think once Egypt falls, that's the main. First, Alexandria, either Cairo, was in fact surrendered to the Muslims by, according to some of the Coptic historians themselves, by the Coptic Patriarch. Because apparently there was like, you're not going to persecute us. I don't think there was real violent persecution against the Copts, but it was stuff like, the Coptic Patriarch has to pay like double taxes to the Byzantine Emperor or something like that. And I think the Muslims had said, we won't charge you anything, or like a small jizya tax. All right. So the Coptic Patriarch just basically, and the Coptic bishops surrender Egypt. And of course, these weren't Orthodox bishops. And at that point, it's going to be a long, drawn out campaign you can do it, but they can conquer North Africa, and then once they conquer North Africa, then they invade Spain, etc. I don't know. Are you there, Father Joseph?
Yeah.
So I'm just saying is that it's not Christendom's fault that all these areas were lost. You're talking about imagine a case in which the United States had two massive land invasion 20-year wars in a row, all right, that were being fought between it and an enemy just of equal power with nuclear weapons, with large portions of populations dying, and then another enemy out of nowhere comes and is able to conquer half the United States. Most people would think, that's not great, but it's reasonable. So I think a lot of people say this because they think somehow the Christendom, had defective, things in it, but the Persians got conquered too. But I would say also there was probably some theological element in that God was obviously against the Byzantine Empire because, frankly, they were monothelite throughout the 640s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and in fact, it seems to be that once you get to the 680s and Orthodoxy returns, there is kind of a stabilization in the Byzantine Empire. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that. That's just my opinion, Father.
As for divine sanction of victories in the war, I tend against that because, from a purely earthly standpoint, Christians are supposed to lose until the very end. And what I mean by that is that basically it's not until judgment where we will be a small flock on earth. I've heard the argument put forth that because of the Council of Florence, I've heard both versions of it being that divine judgment being upon. I'm never a fan of stuff like that.
But it happened in the Old Testament, definitely.
Well, it did, but the point is, I tend to think in the new dispensation, then everyone begins justifying their victory as blessed by God.
Well, a victory can also be a curse.
Well, yeah, but what I'm saying
Think
is,
about this.
But my point is, I don't want to get into I don't want that's my personal opinion, and I'm not a military strategist by any means, but I don't, I tend to think that victories are caused by people's sins. Losses are caused by people's sins, and by just in terms of failed policy. I don't like to attribute it to God.
Well, the point is that some saints did in fact have revelations predicting a victory, like in the battle of Kulikovo, for example.
Also saints that have had false,
Well, my point is that God in fact can predict victory and can give victory. For example, the battle. If for example there were saints who had visions predicting the victory for the Russian armies defeating the Crusaders invading Russia.
Yeah,
and I think there was divine sanction, because if Russia had fallen to the Crusaders, Orthodoxy would have been in a very bad position.
Well, yeah, and I don't doubt that. But then take, for example, St. Alexander Nevsky. I mean, he lost on purpose because he knew what would happen. Wait a second here. Okay, I'm not trying to argue, but St. Alexander Nevsky chose not to fight the Mongols because he realized that he'd rather be under the Mongol yoke than under the Crusaders. I understand it. But the point is, he was offered an alliance with the Swedes, but he knew what would happen.
Exactly.
So the point I'm trying to make is that even losing is sometimes winning.
I absolutely agree.
I don't want to put everything like okay, this loss was because of God or so on and so.
Remember the prophet Jeremiah, I believe in his book, either Isaiah or Jeremiah, was actually saying that the Israelite king, the king of Judah, should surrender to the Babylonians, because it was God's will that if they tried to fight, it was going to actually destroy the nation even more. So, I mean, there is. I agree with you. There is a truth to the fact that,
right, we have as from a spiritual standpoint. And again, I'm not trying to knock the whole question of historical military strategy, so on and so forth.
This gets into the just war question too.
It goes into just war, and it ultimately goes into sometimes God's judgment will not match what we think is victory.
Yes, I mean the people are going to be given the kings and the rulers they ultimately morally deserve, I believe.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
In that there's a lot of more consequences. I mean, you just, for example, imagine if the Byzantine. But here's what I mean. Imagine if the Byzantine Empire had defeated the Ottomans in 1453 and had been able to take everything back. Now that would have been even worse, because then you'd have a Uniate emperor enforcing the Unia upon newly conquered Orthodox in Asia Minor. In other words, defeat was in fact the judgment of God in two ways. One, for the heresy, but two, to preserve the Orthodox from being, to preserve many people in the church.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Okay. Someone says, were we pacifists? No, as we were just discussing, this was an issue of pacifism. Nigel says, is it true that St. Cyril himself predicted the Jewish Revolution, USR, overthrow of the Tsar, and period after when Orthodoxy would be restored? He certainly predicted an overthrow of the Tsar. You have to be careful with some of these prophecies. Like there was something like 120 prophecies attributed to St. John of Kronstadt, for example, in which there's really only 4 or 5 we actually know from his own pen. And what happens is that there have be some disciple who someone will record, oh, I knew Father so-and-so back in 1935 in the camps, and this person told Father so-and-so who told Father so-and-so. At that point, you got to be very careful, because a lot of stuff could be mangled. But I do believe the prediction of the revolution, of the persecution in the church, that was true. But some of the other stuff you got to be real careful with. So Basil says he did, and I read it. Okay, yeah, so it's true. We agree with that. But I'm just saying, not every prophecy someone says this was by some Russian. For example, there was some prophecy attributed to some elder back in 1948 in the Moscow Patriarch who said, you must not trust the Free Russian Church. You must destroy them if you find them. Well, how was he talking about the Free Russian Church in 1948? There was no Free Russian Church. What had happened was there was somebody in the Moscow Patriarchate had taken this elder's predictions in 1948 and put the word Free Russian Church and even Russian Orthodox Autonomous Church in it to justify what was being done in Suzdal. So some of this stuff you have to make sure there are no interpolations in the manuscripts. And I've dealt with a lot of interpolations in manuscripts.
Yeah.
It does not make the text worthless. You got to be careful sometimes. Vienna says, didn't that same prophecy by Saint John predict that Turkey would be divided up too? I don't know, because I've heard similar things. People saying that someone predicted Father so and so Matthäus predicted General so and so would conquer Constantinople.
That was when talking about Turkey. I don't ever remember.
Yeah, and the thing is that even some of the stuff attributed to Saint Seraphim, you have to figure out what's actually the most accurate and what's not written by some person 40 years after and one based upon folklore about Saint Seraphim. All right. Then the problem is that it's not that we're denying that revelations to saints happen. They do, in fact, they do happen. They do happen, and they continue to happen. The question is, just because everybody says, "Oh, Saint so and so said this," doesn't mean he actually said it. For example,
look at the text.
Yeah. For example, some people used to say, and I've heard this, that Saint John Maximovich at one point stopped in the middle of the street and said, "The Antichrist has been born." Well, did he say that, or was there something else where he, someone says, well, his third cousin told this deacon who told this person, and I heard it at Jordanville. And I'm not doubting the person who told me it. That's what they heard at Jordanville. All right. But when you start to look at it, it's really not as strong as you think. It could have been something like St. John Maximovich told them that, I hope the Antichrist isn't born yet. You know what I mean? And then they got mingled, because there's a difference between the tradition of the church and the oral tradition of the elders of the church, not of the Jewish elders like the Pharisees,
right?
And just the telephone game. All right. Because the tradition of the church is preserved by a whole infrastructure around it. All right. Baylord says, what happened to the Church of the East? By that, I assume you mean the Assyrian Nestorians. Well, they went in Nestorianism. I mean, that's what happened to them. There's a lot of discussions about how long it took Nestorianism take over the Persian church, because technically you're talking about multiple hundreds of different dioceses that could be divided up. And, for example, there were several councils. One of the Persian emperors actually supported Nestorianism. People kind of forget this because they viewed it as contrary to the position of the Byzantine emperors. And therefore, they promoted Nestorians to take control of church property in Persia and in Mesopotamia over the more Orthodox candidates. So an Orthodox bishop, there could be an Orthodox bishop of Nineveh. But guess what? The Persian emperor just basically says, okay, now your cathedral I'm taking away and I'm giving to this Nestorian guy. All right. So, they became Nestorians. I mean, you might want to be more specific if you have a more specific question. Let's go back to the Facebook questions, Father. Basil.
Actually, I actually have to take off a little bit early right now.
Okay, go ahead. I'm just going to continue answering questions then.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Good night, all, and
okay. Oh, now remember, somebody has to turn off the mechanism after I'm done.
Okay, no problem.
Okay.
Okay,
so the Facebook question 7 is, how have nursing mothers traditionally participated in fasting seasons? I believe, I don't have my rudder with me, and my computer is very slow, but in the back of the Pedalion, there are canons by individual fathers. And I think it's Patriarch Saint Nicephorus, I believe, maybe incorrect, who talks about this. He speaks, in that case, he speaks about pregnant women. And the question is, do pregnant women have to fast? And the Patriarch says that the purpose of fasting, there are many purposes of fasting, but he says the purpose of fasting is humbling the body. And to be pregnant is to have the body humbled extremely. So that was why women were traditionally exempted from strict fasting rules. Now, you can argue that, maybe there's a way you can, in fact, arrange the fasting days around such that, a woman could, eat foods that are still fasting but are still filling, and that's kind of a nutritionist thing. But things like where a pregnant woman should have a complete fasting where she doesn't eat for 18 hours or for only bread and water or something like that, the fathers have never enforced that. A lot of exemptions are made for pregnancy. My opinion is, for a nursing mother, you're probably going to have similar exemptions. I would be simply against abusing it. It doesn't mean doesn't mean because a mother is nursing and it's Holy Friday, she should say, well, I'm going to go to the Chinese buffet and eat all the sesame chicken I want, because that may be also bad too. So a lot of this has to be discussed with the priest and with the family and also with a doctor. But exemptions will be made from strict fasting for nursing mothers, just as for pregnant women. 8. So someone asked the question, is renting or leasing an example of usury in your minds? Some would say so. I do not. I think we may have been asked this before. I do not quite know, because if you're renting let me think about that. If you're renting a property, let's see, renting goes back, I think that goes back. That was never out. I don't think anyone has ever thought of that as usury. I don't think so. I would just have to think about that a little bit more. Protestants are heterodox, Muslims, etc., etc. Well, they're all heterodox. They're all not, Let's see. Okay, let me see if there's any other question. Okay, so no other questions in the chat I can see. I will, since it's just me, I'll try to continue with the Facebook questions sent to me via Facebook. Question 9. How do the Orthodox churches historically react to the invention of electrically operated machines like the light bulb? I recall the Pope at the time spoke of some of the vicious consequences of the development, like that one would be able to stay up later and sin. Well, that's probably true. I don't know if the Pope said that, and it wouldn't really matter. He had authority or something, I don't really know if there was a lot of protest against. See, the thing with technology is you have to ask a lot of questions. One, is this technology, is it prone to be used in a moral sense? Can it be used in a moral sense? For example, if I develop a plague bomb that is a super form of the bubonic plague and kills 99.995% of people, that's not a moral technology. I don't see how that could be morally developed. It's much easier to get into weapons technology. If someone develops a machine that can, for example, in vitro fertilization, in vitro technology, I don't think that's a moral technology. I don't see the light bulb as essentially bad. I think it's simply an easier version of the candle without getting rid of the candle. I think people should still make and have candles, beeswax and such. But and someone can correct me here, and they might be more knowledgeable people, but I don't really think there was a lot of negative reaction to the invention of the light bulb. Certainly in Greece, there was no negative reaction, I don't think. And in Russia, I don't think there was a negative reaction. Even some of the old believers who were separated from the church might have had a negative reaction, but even most old believers today accept the light bulb. But that's a larger question about technology, and I think ultimately technology should be judged on. Well, we're not slaves to technology. Technology should serve moral purposes for the good of society, and that good should be a moral good, not just the good of, not just some immoral definition of what society should desire. Question 10, how should Orthodox evangelize? Well, Orthodox should evangelize by talking to people about the Orthodox Church, getting people interested in the Orthodox Church. I used to have these little pamphlets. I don't have them anymore because I guess I printed like 100 of them. I used to, every now and again, would hand them out to people who came to church. I have these like little pocket New Testaments that Father Joseph and I went to a store and we bought like 20 of them for $1. And they're not the Gideon's ones. They're just pocket King James New Testament, no commentary, just that. And every now and again, I would give a pamphlet about Orthodoxy with the New Testament. There are multiple ways to evangelize in your daily life. Just say, look, I'm more, if someone has a problem, say that you'll pray for them. If someone asks a moral question, you can explain the Orthodox answer. If you're going into evangelism in the sense of going into like a pagan, like in the middle of in the middle of part of the Muslim Nigeria or something like that, will probably be a little bit different, but you're still carrying the Orthodox faith. You have to learn the language in those cases. So there's missionary techniques, but Orthodox should evangelize by talking about orthodoxy. and by trying their best to live a repentant life. You're going to fall. You're going to make all kinds of terrible mistakes. But the worst thing you should ever do is give up, because that sets the worst example. 11. Is it permissible to neuter one's animals from an Orthodox standpoint? I believe it is. Animals are not people. I have dogs. I've had dogs growing up. We've, people have had cat. I've had every now and again had a cat. Animals we do not have the same fundamental moral responsibility to an animal, even a dog, even though we may love them a lot, as we do to a baby or to a person. That does not mean we have permission to torture animals. That's evil. But controlling animal breeding, that is a part of our ability, and at least in this fallen world, even in the pre-fall world, but in the fallen world even more, to manage nature. Not to destroy it, but to manage it. But people are not animals, so neutering people is a different point than neutering animals. Basil says, some of these are rather bizarre, but they should be fun to answer. They certainly were. Okay, so that's all of Basil Polivka, the question someone sent him and he sent me. And I'm not sure I have any. Let me see if there are any other questions in the chat before I either sign off or I get more questions in the chat. What is the evidence for the resurrection? Well, we find it in the New Testament. The earliest documents in the New Testament are some of the epistles of Paul, supposedly. I mean, although I argue, I'm almost inclined to believe that Gospel of Matthew was probably written around like 38 or 40 AD. I know some moderns don't believe that. But one would be, what is the counter-explanation? All right? Well, what did the Jews say? Well, the Jewish the Pharisee, Sanhedrin, Sadducees were like, well, they stole his body. Well, how do they steal his body? How do you manage to, fight off a Roman guard, break a sealed tomb, and not have anybody find out about it ever? I don't think that's possible. Two, it says in our earliest accounts in the New Testament that, what did it say? At 1.300, I can't remember, 400 brethren saw the Lord after he had risen from the dead. So there's eyewitness testimony. I think that's kind of a traditional answer to that. So I don't really think that I should probably write an in-depth paper. There have been a lot of people, both Protestant, Roman Catholic, and Orthodox, who have gone through this. I don't have anybody to bounce off questions with me about Father Joseph here, so my brain is kind of scattering a bit near the end. But we'll go over the question about the evidences for the resurrection on either Thursday or next Tuesday, because there's a lot to be said about that. I think one evidence would be the testimony of the deaths of the apostles themselves. You have people like St. Peter. You have people like St. Matthew. You have people like St. John, although he didn't die a martyr, he certainly suffered like a martyr. St. Andrew. How did all the apostles die? They died as martyrs. They were either crucified upside down, they were shot through with spears, they were dumped into boiling barrels of oil, when they could have just said at the very end, no, we made it all up. But they chose to endure horrific punishments, whereas before the resurrection, they were deserting the Lord left and right, except for St. John. But after the resurrection, you have these timid people like St. Peter, St. Andrew, and others who had deserted the Lord before, who, when they saw the physical resurrected Christ, were profoundly changed. And at that point, you put yourself in that position. You see the resurrected God-man. For sure everything he said is true. And they went to their death for that. So I think that testimony, if I knew 11 people who, if for example, if 11 people told me, that I saw elder so-and-so raise a man from the dead or heal a man of cancer, or, there was a, man decapitated and he prayed and the head reattached. And these 12 people or 11 people were tortured horribly to recant and they refused to. I would absolutely, even if I didn't know this elder, I'd say that happened. or at least those men believed it happened, and it would be the only logical thing that if there's an elder, he did it. It's a miracle. But we'll go over the evidence for the resurrection, and I think the next program we're kind of getting near the end. We might go a little bit over time. Logos Apologia says, why did the Byzantines make the Coptics pay more than others? I heard you stated earlier. I may be mistaken, but there were restrictions on the Copts because they were heretics. Generally, I think they did have to pay a little bit extra taxes. There were various laws in the Code of Justinian and in the Roman legal codes from the 400s that people who were not Orthodox did have to. They for example, they had restrictions in how they could inherit property. If there was an Orthodox relative who was like a cousin, he might inherit the property, even though the man might be the son. And the view was that if you're not Orthodox, then you're not part of the state. You're not part of what should be part of the state, and you're a negative influence. Now, remember, it's not like the Monophysite Coptics had some sort of moral argument here, because they essentially had control of the imperial government from, I don't know, the 480s into like the time of 518 or so, during the time of the Emperor Zeno, who was like pro-Monophysite. And they certainly didn't treat the Orthodox that nice, and they certainly have the same rules applied against the Orthodox. But generally in the Byzantine state, if you were not Orthodox, even though they wouldn't be torturing you to death and such, you would have disabilities placed upon you. It would be somewhat analogous, if you were to talk about it, to the position of, I don't know, like a black person in 1920s Maryland or Delaware. I know that's a kind of hot topic to bring up, but you had rights, but there were legal segregation laws. Now, the difference is that in the case of religion, you can convert and you can change your position. But that was just their view. The state had to have one religion. And if you weren't part of that religion, you had some sort of soft persecution exacted upon you. And I guess the Copts, by surrendering their cities to the Muslims, somehow felt, well, the Muslims are going to give us a better deal. Well, it turned out they didn't give them a better deal. They had a worse deal. And probably I would say that if the Muslims hadn't conquered Egypt, I don't really see the Coptic Monophysite schism heresy have continuing much, much longer. I think it probably would have been subsumed eventually, probably in a few hundred years, back into Orthodoxy, but that did not happen. Okay, Nigel says, Father, can you say expelliarmus and cure me because I'm stagnant or drunk right now? Goobo woobo. Well, be careful. You shouldn't be drunk. I'm not going to say there's nothing I can do over the internet. You should be very careful and go sleep. Okay. So I apparently people have been complaining about Faraj. I've only now been looking at the chat. I'm very sorry if I have not been monitoring it very well. Okay. Let's see. Yes, Brandon Thorpe says St. John the Revelator was the only one to die of old age, but only because he survived being buried alive. That's exactly right. St. John. There was something called the St. John of the Latin Gate. The Latin Gate was one of the ancient gates of Rome. Now, some people say it's an anachronism that the Latin Gate was technically constructed in the late 2nd century, but that doesn't really prove anything. They're just saying that it happened at where the Latin Gate is now. So it's like someone said, oh, this happened on old Route 3, but now Route 3 is called Highway, 15 or something, or someone says it happened on Highway 15, but it used to be called old Route 3. That's no proof that something didn't happen there because you're using a different name. Father, should we have blasphemy laws? Oh, I would say yes. And I don't think that's as controversial as people think, because I think there should be. My opinion, again, is very much different than the modern liberal Enlightenment opinion. Blasphemy laws were part of the laws of the vast majority of U.S. states, or all U.S. states, until the 1940s, and there were several Supreme Court decisions that overturned them. It didn't mean they were executing atheists. It didn't mean there weren't even atheist societies, because sometimes they didn't apply the blasphemy laws in an extreme sense, or sometimes there are ways to get around them. But there were laws that felt you could not go around, attacking Christ, the Virgin, and the saints, and attacking Christianity, because people realized, even if they didn't have the right type of Christianity, they realized that this was the foundation of a good society. And so I think there should be some sort of blasphemy laws. There probably are blasphemy laws in a lot of states' books, but they've been effectively nullified because of the Supreme Court. Again, that does not mean I want to go around killing people, executing, or torturing them. But I think there is a legitimate case for blasphemy law, so I do agree. Logos Apologia says, Copts say they are not Monophysites. They say that they have the same Christology, but semantic is differing. Like you say milk and coffee, and they say coffee and milk. Milk and coffee and coffee and milk. Well, first off, how are they not Monophysites? They say they're Miaphysites, but mono and meo both mean either one or single. So if someone says they're a Miaphysite, so they believe in a single nature, as opposed to Monophysite, one nature. It's like someone saying, look, I have a single car. How many cars do you have? I just have a single one. Someone said, but another person says, well, I have one car. How many cars do you have? I have one. They're Monophysite and Miaphysite are really the same thing. They don't accept the Council of Chalcedon. They violently reject it. They anathematize Saint Leo the Great, by the way. The Orthodox have interacted with the Monophysites 450, 650, 750, 850. So let's talk about just up to the 750s to St. John Chrysostom's time for 300 years. St. John Chrysostom says explicitly that the Monophysites are like the Orthodox in all ways, but for them being heretics and not having the correct Christology. And St. John Chrysostom knew the Syriac language. He interacted with the Syro-Jacobites, who were just the Monophysite version, the Monophysites in Syria. He wrote a book called Against the Jacobites. He wrote another book called Against the Nestorians, which have not been translated into English. You can find them in the Patrologia. I've only been able to look at them through the Latin side because my Greek is not that strong. But all the saints and fathers who interacted with them seem to say this is more than a linguistic difference. The Monophysites, for example, a lot of them deny. You ask the Monophysites, do they reject monothelitism? And they'll be very coy about the answer, or they'll say that they do accept monothelitism. You look at the modern last Coptic Pope, Pope Shenouda. He not only taught monophysitism in that Christ had one will, he also taught things like, he didn't believe in the uncreated energies of God. He believed when you receive the Eucharist, you only receive the physical, you only receive the body and blood, but he did believe you didn't receive the divine power through the Eucharist, because in essence, he had a Nestorian view of the communion. So I would say they are Monophysites. Now, the average Coptic person, I've interacted with average Coptic people. I mean, a lot of them are very nice people. I feel very sorry for their situation. That does not mean I justify their ecclesiastical situation. And I've had conversations with regular ones, and I say, do you believe Jesus Christ is God and man? And they'll say, yes. And I say, do you believe Christ has two natures? He's a one person with two natures. And many will say, apparently he don't have much of education in their own religion. Yes, they do believe that. And I'll explain effectively the teachings by using the actual decrees of the Fifth Council, the Sixth Council. And some of them will say, well, I don't know why we never accepted this. It was probably a big mistake. And some of them actually do believe that. But when you're in a heresy and schism for so long, and then let's say 1,000, 1,500 years later, you begin to realize, our ancestors made a lot of mistakes. They didn't really understand what they were doing. What happens is so much water under the bridge, it's very difficult to change after that period of time. Because for example, a Coptic person will say, well, my great-grandfather was killed by the Muslims because he refused to become a Muslim. And they have a personal reason for not wanting to convert, even though they may tell me that I personally know you're right, but I can't leave the Coptic Church because of my family and how my family will think about me, etc. And that's a choice people have to make, to choose between what is truth, what is for salvation, and what is just going to please your family. Hopefully they should both be the same, but if they're different, as our Lord said that he who does not hate father and mother, brother, sister, does not reject all those things for my sake, cannot inherit the kingdom of God. That doesn't mean you have to hate them in the sense of emotionally hate them. It means that in comparison with seeking after the truth, everything else should be secondary. Bait Lord says, individualism or collectivism? I do not. Individualism definitely is not part of the church tradition. You have this very negative influence of libertarianism that's come into Orthodoxy through both convert circles and through people in, being influenced by kind of the Western thought process, the fallen Western philosophy that believe, I guess, the purpose of society and of the church is for the individual alone. And that's not true. I don't know, but by collectivism, I see. I'm very cautious about saying I endorse collectivism because I'm not sure if this is not some kind of false dialectic that's being created. And I could say, oh, I endorse collectivism, and then someone says, well, the Marxist, and this was term was coined by some Emma Goldman or something like that. And we go, oh no, I don't embrace it then, But I would say that if we can understand that societism, you might say that the traditional way of society is for the family and for the extended family and for the nation. And even in empires where you had multiple different ethnic groups, they all found some sort of way, traditionally as Orthodoxy would teach, for them to all cooperate. They have one emperor or one ruler, even if they have local autonomies. So I would say definitely individualism is not part of the Orthodox tradition. It's not even part of any other tradition, I think, until you get to Protestantism. And then even in Protestantism, even though they technically rejected it, I think the Lutherans and the Presbyterians would have rejected individualism. But one can argue, and I think effectively, that you have presuppositions in their thought process, like sola scriptura, that eventually kind of led to this. And I think you can even argue with papism that with the exaltation of the authority of one man, the Pope, that created a sort of individualism. I think that, there's too much to get into, but I would say some sort of modified Orthodox collectivism that recognizes that the family is important without, saying the individual doesn't matter at all. But recognizing the spiritual value of a person as being made in the image of God and wanting his salvation, that is not individualism. The father of the family who wants to take care of his daughter or his son and pays a lot of attention to them, does that mean he's embracing individualism by focusing a lot of attention on them? No, it's because he loves them. And so the state, if it's a proper state, a good state promoting good and restricting evil, it should focus on those duties, promoting good and restricting evil. And the best way to do that is through the communal structure, I believe. Vienna says, how can I convince my girlfriend to be submissive? I do not know. There's a whole lot of stuff. People ask me questions like this, and I'm saying, well, they got to be Orthodox first. And, I think they're not going to like this, but being unequally yoked, if you're going to be Orthodox and being unequally yoked with unbelievers in a girlfriend-boyfriend relationship is very dangerous. I know people, a lot of young men, finally get a girlfriend, and then they want to become Orthodox, and they realize, well, I can be baptized, but then I can't be with my girlfriend anymore because it's fornication unless she converts, and that causes a lot of problems. But again, I would still say you have to go after the truth rather than just wanting to have a girlfriend. Hopefully, they would want to become Orthodox, they would want to be baptized, and you should exhaust a lot of possibilities, but you have to follow the moral rules for that. And them becoming submissive is something that naturally should and will follow with their acceptance of Orthodoxy. It doesn't mean them being a slave, obviously. And you have to explain things to kind of take away the brainwashing the Marxist feminists and others have kind of put into things. But it still is an ordered system of leadership and followers. Should we stone Dawkins for blaspheming so much? Well, first off, in Orthodox countries, I don't believe stoning was ever I'm not sure I don't think it was ever executed for blasphemy. I think in the context of today, if you tried to execute somebody like a Dawkins for blasphemy, because he has such a following, or at least he claims to be, it will probably make him a martyr, as opposed to if there was like some weird atheist philosopher back in Constantinople in the year 1000, he'd probably be locked up in an insane asylum or whatever they had, or simply expelled from the city, and he'd be laughed at. But I don't think stoning. I think arguing him would be much better at this point. We're too far away to go that route. And even executing people, again, as I explained, people like St. Martin of Tours, St. Siracius of Rome, St. Ambrose of Milan, St. John Chrysostom, St. Theodore the Studite, were not for executing people for blasphemy. That didn't mean they thought they should be allowed to go around disrupting the social order without being restricted. But no, just one rock, a pebble. No, I don't even think that. Someone says I guess it means that some of the Protestants likely have no idea what they believe. I once read a book by a Baptist preacher that claimed that Christ was not God, but the Spirit in him was. Or the Monophysites, he means. Well, that may be true. I've heard similar stories where a lot of them, have really no idea what they're teaching. Their system has been so corrupted that even they're on the books. There was a convert to the Monophysite church named Father Peter Farrington, who several years ago wrote that even the Coptic bishops did not understand or did not even know most of the teachings of Severus of Antioch, who was the main Monophysite teacher, who really effectively formulated Monophysite theology in reaction to Orthodoxy only around the 540s. So that's probably true. I haven't. And the Baptists, what do they say? Well, I've in fact encountered growing up. I knew a lot of Protestants. I was one. I grew up as a Protestant. Good night, Baylord. When I grew up as a Protestant, I can tell you this: I was taught Arianism, even though I was I was going to a Methodist church. Why was I taught Arianism? Well, because they didn't explain theology very well. They assumed people were too uneducated or it's too much to talk about consubstantiality. We never used even the Apostles' Creed, let alone the Nicene Creed, even in the interpolated form. People would say, oh, Christ is the Son of God. A lot of people did not understand what that meant because they weren't in the original context of the first century, where if you call someone the true Son of God in the first century and in the Jewish culture, a son is equal in nature to the Father. They're going to understand what you're claiming immediately. But, I only rejected Arianism once I read the Gospel of John, and I actually talked to a Sunday school teacher one time who said, we don't believe in the Unitarian belief. And I said, well, what's the Unitarian belief? And they're like, oh, they don't believe Jesus is God. And I felt really embarrassed. Oh, well, how could I have been mistaken so long? Because, combined with the Good News Bible and these horrible Sunday school lessons and the Protestants, and even among when I was younger, a young teenager, and I went to a Baptist church. I pointed this out to Baptist youth ministers when they were doing these sinner prayer, kind of like 15-minute sermonettes, and then having people do the so-called sinner's prayer, which again, the sinner's prayer was invented essentially like the 1850s or something like that. I was pointing out that, look, you're not going through how Christ is the Son of God. And they're like, whoa, St. Peter didn't say that, and he didn't talk about the consubstantiality in the book of Acts. And I said, well, when St. Peter was addressing the Jews, he was preaching to them Pentecost, he was saying, you killed Christ. You knew who he was. You knew what he taught. You know what he meant by saying the Son of God. And they were leading people in the sinner's prayer. And I was saying, look, how are these people really converted? They don't believe in the deity of Christ. Most of them didn't believe in the deity of Christ, and they continue not to believe in it. And some people, and they didn't really care. Doctrinal teaching was at a horrible state in Protestantism. And I'm not trying to just attack individual, because I know there's some Protestants who will say, well, I don't do that at my church. And I'm sure they aren't, but that's part of the problem. With the modern culture, and I think how Protestantism has degenerated and continues to degenerate every single generation. Logos Apologia said, what do you think of people who say having or thinking you are 100% right and your theology makes you pseudo-Gnostic, where knowledge grants you heaven? Dog is barking for some reason. That's not correct. How is saying you're 100% right makes you a pseudo-Gnostic? If, St. Peter says, St. Peter said, I knew 100% the Lord rose from the dead. How am I a Gnostic because I say that? A Gnostic is someone who says that the material world is evil. That's the essential part of Gnosticism. Material world is evil. God didn't create the universe, they claim. They claim the universe was created. I don't even believe they believe creation ex nihilo. They believe it was made by this demiurge kind of being out of pre-existing matter. There's a lot. The word Gnostic is thrown around so much, I don't think people realize what they're talking about. That does not make you a Gnostic. You can tell the person who asks you that's a stupid question. Having certainty of faith that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and that the Orthodox faith is the true faith, that's actually having faith. That's what you should have. No, we should not hit anybody. So, is it fine to spank one's wife or kids? I do not. I would assume we should avoid physical violence. I would be more inclined to say that every now and again spanking children without beating them or bruising them or leaving permanent marks is acceptable under certain circumstances. I got spanked as a kid. If I ever said a curse word growing up, I in fact got slapped in the mouth. and I never regret that. I know some people. I mean, that might actually get that. Might, I remember one time talking about spanking children when I was 7 years old, and I was in like one of the rooms in the house, and my father was lifting weights, and I had heard the F word for the very first time, and I used it, and my father dropped the weights immediately, and I was like, "Oh no, no, no!" And I ran behind the couch, and he caught me, and he spanked me. I used to get that, and one other time I used a curse word at my grandmother's house, and she washed my mouth out with soap, which is why after that, unlike everybody else around me, and there were a lot of people around me who didn't use cursing a whole lot because that was how we were trained. Now, some can say, like, you got this crazy fellow like Stephen Molyneux who says you shouldn't discipline your kids with any physical violence, even very, very small things, or watching them. I mean, I don't see that as making any sense. That's like saying, you can't discipline prisoners by locking them up. That's physical violence. You got to restrain somebody. So I think it's acceptable to spank children within moderation. Though I think once you start getting to like them being 11 or 12 or 13 years old, you should probably, they have to have a little bit more responsibility. Part of the reason that you do spanking, I believe, and people can disagree with this, is if a child is too young to understand the reasoning behind the moral precepts. Part of the reason society does allow some exertion of moderate means of physical violence is to impress upon young minds you don't do these things. Now, ideally, there should be a culture which should have already enforced that, in which spanking should be as a last resort. But I only ever got spanked when we did something really bad, like, I don't know, I cursed, or I took a fork and I jabbed it in a light socket, and I never did that again. I got spanked after I got electrocuted, and it taught me not to do those things again, even though I didn't understand why it wasn't right. Then I later understood. Okay, let me see. Are there any other questions? Okay, so I think this is somewhat. We should need to control the chat here, please. And I think that's it. Okay, well, if I do not know how to deactivate the video, so no. Okay, Nigel, you need to ask serious questions, not this crazy stuff. Okay, well, I think we're out of questions, and I went 20 minutes over, so I'm going to close down the chat and close down the Google Hangout, and hopefully Father Joseph or someone else will deactivate the live stream. Well, thank you for. Okay, someone asked. Okay, I got another question, so I guess I can go continue. Logos Apologia says, why is Coptic Church growing more rapidly in America than Eastern Orthodox Church? I don't know that it is. Is it? Is it growing because there are more Copts, Egyptians, ethnic Egyptians moving over here? Are you having hundreds and hundreds of Irish and English Americans, German Americans converting to the Monophysite Coptic Church? I haven't seen that. Maybe there are some, but as a rule, I haven't seen that. So I would say they're not growing more rapidly. I mean, you'd have to give me a statistics about that, rather than some Coptic person saying this on some Coptic forum or something. Okay, well, since that is the last question and there are no more questions, then I will close down the Google Hangout, and hopefully some Father Joseph will, through his iPhone or the mechanism, close down the live stream. Thank you for the questions. Hopefully we will get more. We will try to, next program, have a much more organized format here. Okay, God bless and good night. Benedicite.